Hi everyone, welcome to the latest edition of my vlog. Um, so today I am talking about introduction to segregated witness. Myself Priyabrata Dash, I call myself also Priyab Satoshi. My Twitter handle is tweetmyreview. So I am just quickly going through the topic called introduction to SegWit or segregated witness. Uh, this is something that is already live in production, Bitcoin production, and this is part of a three-part series where I'll be talking about segregated witness, Lightning Network, and atomic swap. So, and if there are four future videos, I'll be taking them. Uh, so the agenda for today's session is Bitcoin transactions, the scaling debate, SegWit details or introduction to SegWit, which is also called segregated witness, its benefits, and also I will be giving the Bitcoin improvement proposals that were key to the implementation of SegWit. And again, the topics would not be in an order of they may change depending on the requirement of the session or the topic. I may move some of the topics before or after, so so that we are more clear on what is SegWit. Okay, so I'll be first talking about Bitcoin transactions. Before even going to segregated witness, we have to understand how Bitcoin transaction is organized. Basically, a Bitcoin transaction is it's a group of inputs which again gives a set of outputs. So a transaction would have the input information of the sender, and the output part would have the information of the receivers for that transaction. And all of these transactions, so how it operates is that the input part of this transaction is signed by the receiver, and there are certain unlock signatures which then used to validate the transaction, and and are used by the receiver to unlock for future transactions that he would be doing. And this chain of transactions is what is organized in a block, and these blocks of the transactions are known as blockchain, which is kept on each and every node in the Bitcoin network. So typically a Bitcoin transaction structure. Now a Bitcoin transaction is basically a structure that or it's basically it is a packet, like a network packet, and it has certain fields, and these fields are packed together in a Bitcoin transaction structure, and whenever it is sent across the network, each of the components in the Bitcoin network, be it a miner, or be it a node, or any other service that runs on top of Bitcoin ecosystem, has to verify this or should understand this Bitcoin transaction structure. So first part is the version of the transaction or the Bitcoin transaction that it is going. So if it is going out of a Bitcoin probably 0.16.0 node, then it would give that version. Then it will give how many input counts are there, that is number of inputs for that transaction. Then it would have a transaction ID. A transaction ID basically consists of what is the amount, what is the probably the sender information, and that's how and it's a unique ID that identifies the transaction. And then you have a signature. A signature comes out of the combination of the previous transaction and what how much is the value that has to be output. And then the output part contains the amount that would be spent. And then in this you also have a locking script and a lock size, and this locking script is what basically defines the the locking signature which would be used by the receiver to unlock or verify and unlock the particular transaction and to be used in future transactions. Okay, so uh, so these specific parts, the inputs and outputs, are repeated as needed. Now, coming back to the block limit, all of these transactions are actually organized in blocks. So I'll just first go to the blocks. So block structure basically contains a header, then it contains set of transactions. So the header would usually contain a version number for the whole block, then the reference to the previous block. Like in case of transaction, we have a reference. The input contains a reference to the previous transaction. The same way, a block would also contain a reference to the previous block. In the same way, there is the Merkle root. The Merkle root contains a hash of all the transactions that are present within the block. So why it is so is because whenever this particular transaction is sent across the network, Bitcoin network, nodes that are verifying the Bitcoin transaction need not verify all the particular transactions from the start of Genesis block. That would be time consuming. Just by checking the Merkle root, they can verify a transaction. And that how a Merkle tree is root is formed is by actually hashing using SHA-256 the transaction. Two transactions are mapped to are hashed to a single Merkle root, and then multiple older Merkle roots are actually hashed to a new Merkle root, and that's how the latest root is formed, and that root is present in the header of the transaction. Timestamp is basically provided after a block is mined, and that is unique, that cannot be changed, and for that a proof of work is required. And that how this proof of work is dependent upon, it is dependent upon the previous block and also the nonce that we are setting. The nonce is a unique factor which is a binary which is basically a binary digit, and this nonce decides how much complex your Bitcoin transaction has to be, or sorry, the mining effort has to, how much time the proof of work would take to do the mining or to verify the transaction, and that's what is basically sets up the difficulty of the overall network. And depending on how difficult is the nonce, the hash rate of the network is determined, and based on that how much time also to verify transactions will depend. The average time to for the network to verify transactions will be determined. Now there are two parts of the block. So whenever you send a transaction, they are unverified transactions. These unverified transactions would be kept in something called mempool. So basically mempool is what contains all the transactions that you send into the network and to the miners. From the mempool, the miners will take transactions, and then depending on the transaction fee, and whatever, and they will do the whole mining process, proof of work, and then once the proof of work is done, they would add your transaction into a block, and then they will circulate this block into the network, and that's what would come and that particular block, once it comes to your all the other nodes, they would keep it into they would keep it into a chain. There is a chain of these blocks, and these chain of blocks are again the thing is that there is always a possibility that multiple miners can mine the same transaction and can send multiple blocks. But what happens is that, so when it comes to the node, it will maintain multiple versions of the chain from different blocks that it is covering. So each of these versions will be separate chains. That's why that for a transaction to be verified, it will wait for 20 confirmations. So once the 20 confirmations are happening, that is 20 new blocks that are formed, and if a specific transaction is so the longest. So what happens like this? Now a new block is mined. Let's say it so it contains a reference to previous block. So that is again sent to the node. It keeps that block. Same way, 20 more blocks such it would be added, and the longest block that the chain that has all the valid blocks becomes the is known as the blockchain. So by the time 20 blocks happens, it's very difficult to change it up, and that's how the attack on Bitcoin network is becomes difficult. So the important things that you need to understand. One is the nouns, which sets the difficulty level of the network for doing proof of work, and that creates that sets how slow or fast your network is. That is one important aspect. Then you have to understand that how blocks the how your unverified transactions are present within mempool. The size of a mempool at any given point of time would be either 1 GB compressed 1 to 1.5 GB, and uncompressed it would be 10 GB in memory. And this is where all your transactions which are to be verified are kept. These are not confirmed transactions, mind you. And the more transactions are there in the mempool, you would know that network is slower or faster, or how much clogged the network is. And then there is the another key aspect to note is that a block is of 1 MB size. So that is where the concept of block limit comes in. Now in Bitcoin network right now, the previously the Bitcoin block was didn't had a size limit. Anybody can send as much size, but there was a problem that there was a risk that a lot of malicious miners can flood the network with malicious blocks, and what would happen is that they would put crappy transactions within the block, and that would bring down the network. To prevent that, Satoshi Nakamoto created a new idea of having 1 MB block size. So with 1 MB block size, what we are effectively doing is, if anybody tries to send anything bigger than 1 MB, that would be rejected. And with 1 MB size also, the effective the clogging of the Bitcoin network will not also happen. So if there are more and more, because you have to understand these transactions are sent across all the nodes. These blocks are sent across all the nodes within the network. So it is always better to have a smaller size of block than bigger, and that's how the approach was drawn at that point of time. At that time, it was understood, depending on 2009 2010, by the Moore's law, that 1 MB was an optimum size to send across the network. You have to understand another point. The transactions that are added within a block have a fixed size. It doesn't have a fixed size. With the number of transactions that are added within a block, each transaction is determined how much space it takes based on size, and the cost of how much would be the transaction fee is determined by the size of the transaction, and that's how your overall transaction fee is determined. That's why, so bigger the transaction cost size, depending on the signature and number of inputs and outputs, your transaction fee would increase, and that's how you would have within your and that would determine, but the limit is 1 MB. So if you have so within that, if your size of a transaction is bigger, then lesser number of transactions would be added. But if your transaction size is small, appropriate and optimum transactions can be added. Alright, so these are all about transactions. So how these transactions are arranged within a block, they all are put into this Merkle tree. That Merkle root is added to the header of the block. So next time, if there is a SP wallet, so there is a light wallet that has to verify transaction, it will always verify the Merkle root and verify a transaction quickly. There is another way of verifying a transaction at a node level, that this particular transaction is valid or not. So the kind of verification or the blocks that are creating verifying transactions happening at a minor end is that it actually verifies if the transaction is valid or not. But the validation of a block at a node end is happens by looking at the header and by checking if the Merkle matches with the transaction details. So that's how your it's all about how the block is a block is formed, the transactions are formed, and how each of these things determine the cost of transactions and how they are arranged within a block and how a blockchain is formed. So if you see this image, the one block contains the reference hash to the previous block, and that's how the chain is formed. All right. Now coming to the scalability and malleability issue. Now what has happened is that we know that 1 MB size is only the maximum size block would be present. So what happens is that given that depending on the size of transactions, only a limited number of transactions can be put into a block. This creates a limited capacity for how many transactions can be put within a block. And because of this, per second, approximately 7 transactions can be processed with the Bitcoin network. And every block is generated at an average time of 10 minutes. And because of this, if the adoption of users increases on Bitcoin network, the number of unconfirmed transactions present as a member increases. And that's how scalability problems. That is, the network gets clogged because there are more users who want to get the transactions verified, but they put their transactions, the member increases, and the number of transactions increases. And because of that, what happens is that miners are selective. They choose what is the best profitable, what is the best profit they can get out of this whole mining process. That's why they only choose the transactions which have high mining or transaction fee. And because of that, what happens is that a lot of unconfirmed transactions increases, or else the transaction cost increases. So it's all interrelated. The bigger because the clogging of network, number of unconfirmed transactions increases. To make sure that your transaction passes through, you have to pay more transaction fee. And since more transaction fees, people actually think that Bitcoin network is broken. And sometimes there is a limited Bitcoin transaction fee that you should be. But right now, last year, Bitcoin transaction fees were raised. To get to transaction you had to pay almost $20-30. And that it took half a day, 1 day, half a day for a transaction to go through. Because of this, what is that various transactions, lower denominations didn't go through, and they sat unconfirmed in the net, and that creates a lot of problem because these your Bitcoin network, when people say is unusable, because it doesn't help to process the low denomination transactions. Okay. I'll just quickly. Okay, so now going back to the scalability and malleability problem. So now let's go back to the scalability and malleability problem. So there is an aspect to this whole scalability or why SegWit is chosen. There is inherent transaction malleability problem within Bitcoin transactions. Since when you are going back to since you have already certain transactions that are this is how a typical transaction is hashed right now. So what happens is that you have unlock signature. So this unlock signature is all about how the transaction is arranged against Bitcoin. So how it is, you are a sender. Your public key along with the previous transaction is actually is in the hash, and then you sign with your private key, and that forms the full signature, and that's the transaction signature that takes almost 60 to 70% of the transaction size. And also, since the signature has certain fields that can be manipulated and reset, these transactions can be reset into the network. This has this issue that somebody can say fix transactions into the network. To fix this issue, the suggestion is given that take out this transaction signature, which already is taking so much space within the initial internal block out, and have a separate section for it. So that's what is all about segregated. I'll be coming to that in next slides. So right now we understood that this signature that is present within the transaction not only takes almost 60 to 70% of the transaction size, and that actually increases the transaction cost, but also is creating the malleability. Now, why would somebody say that transaction cost is increased because of the size of the transaction? Because the cost of the transaction fee is determined, minimum transaction fee is determined by the size of the transaction that is present in the block. Okay. Now let's go to the scalability. Why and how this is happening. Since, if you see, since 2015, the adoption of Bitcoin network is increased. There is an explosion of people who are now are doing transaction on Bitcoin. It can be that they are buying some Bitcoin from exchange and they are moving it to the wallet, or from wallet to wallet migration transfers are happening, or transfers between two exchanges are happening. So there are a lot of ways in which you can transfer your funds. And what happens is that all of these transactions had to be verified and has to go through the Bitcoin network. And since more users are using, there was a point last year where there were because of these Bitcoin Cash flow, and then all these news about Bitcoin adoption and so much of hype, what would happen is more and more users were actually getting into Bitcoin, and they wanted to use this Bitcoin network, and they were doing transactions. What happened is that there is a limited capacity of how many transactions Bitcoin can process per second, but the number of transactions that were put into the network more than the number of transactions that Bitcoin network can process. And that's why what happened, the number of unconfirmed transactions increased. And as I told earlier, the more number of when the number of unconfirmed transactions increases, it also means that the number of miners, because the miners can choose the transactions which has higher fee. Added to this, since the number of miners also increased into the network, there was a difficulty adjustment, and because of this difficulty adjustment, the proof of work also became more complex, and because of that, also the speed at which the transaction can be processed became slower. So 10 minutes is the average, but in these cases it took hours to confirm a transaction, and that actually created the overall scalability debate for last few years that we know now, and it actually came at a loggerhead in 2017. So Bitcoin community was aware of this, that what can happen if more and more adoption of the Bitcoin network happens. And this earlier signs of it were already seen in 2050. And that's why there was a lot of ways in which the Bitcoin community tried to address it. Some said bigger blocks, some said let's use some other what you call variable block size, and some also said let's just follow this approach, SegWit approach, where we also want to have the older network in place. That is the people who do not want to upgrade, because they believe in the original vision of Satoshi Nakamoto. They don't want to change the way Bitcoin network works. They still want to use their older versions, and that's where the whole concept of the solution that was given was SegWit, increasing block size, which was Bitcoin Unlimited, Bitcoin Extreme, and then Bitcoin Cash. and last year sometime about August, April, Bitcoin Cash hard fork happened. Thankfully it was a fork of Bitcoin Cash from the original chain, and they formed a new coin called Bitcoin Cash. But it was with the idea that we would increase the block size, and number of transactions that are present in the block would be increased. It has its own consequences, because when you increase the block size, you are saying that everyone in the network has to accept that block size. So how the block size limit is coded? A block size limit is coded within within the mining software as well as the node software. So anybody who is running the older version of the software have had the block size. If the block size is increased, they would reject it, because their code says 1 MB is the size of the block, and that creates a problem, because then what would happen is that, let's say there is a network that uses only 1 MB block size. There is a network that accepts bigger size of transactions which are bigger than 1 MB block. Like 8 MB, and then what happens, this would create a chain split, because if, let's say, the nodes that are supposed to get 1 MB size, they are rejecting the bigger blocks, and then you send 1 MB blocks, and you have miners who will reject this 1 MB blocks as